Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. 2020 has been a year of huge change, none more so than COVID-19 and all the disruption it's caused to our daily lives. On the crops front, at the start of 2020, growers had to deal with less winter crops in the ground and early challenges of getting more spring crops planted than normal. Then all sorts of weather issues followed in 2020, of which we'll get into in a moment. As a consequence of very challenging national targets for greenhouse gas emissions and questions around sustainability credentials of Irish foods, one of the subtle changes which has occurred in 2020 is the recognition of tillage as a critical part of the Irish agricultural system. A clear example of this is a recently published Ag Climatised document, which sets the general direction of travel for Irish agriculture with an eye to 2050. Amongst the actions identified in this document is to increase the proportion of Irish grains going into livestock rations and also increasing the level of Irish grown protein crops with the aim to support this sustainability credentials of Irish ag food. This document will inform the likes of Foodwise 2020 and also the new CAP, which Ireland has more control over this time round and we're likely to see in 2023. All of these factors are very positive for the tillage farmers and the tillage industry in general. And all we need now is some stable weather to drive yields and increase profitability for the sector. But now I want to come to talk to tillage specialists Shay Phelan and Ciaran Collins and have a look back at 2020. Ciaran and Shay, you're very welcome to the podcast. So Ciaran, for you, what do you see as the highs and lows for the tillage sector for 2020?
Oh, I suppose, Michael, we'll start with the highs. It was a very good growing season once crops got into the ground. I suppose one of the lows obviously was the wet autumn and the difficulty that people had there, and there was a high workload for the spring, but the spring actually came very well. And in the south, we had a very good growing season, really. And I suppose we did have crops with excellent yield potential. Some of the early sown and early harvested spring barley was touching 4 ton in some cases. But I suppose really, from the southern side, the big low for the year was that those good yields weren't realised. We had those 2 storms there in August, and that really, really hit yields for farmers.
Okay, fair enough. And Shay, from your point of view, talking about, I suppose, the Midlands and maybe a little bit further towards the Northeast, what was your highs and lows you kind of see going through the year?
Yeah, well, I suppose, Michael, if we take the Midlands and North of the country, probably the high for me would have been the performance of winter oilseed rape crops. They seem to tolerate the drought that we experienced in a lot of cases better than most other crops. And that's kind of reflected in the outputs this year. The average yield for oilseed rape held up relatively well in comparison to other years. So it actually probably was the best performer for most guys. Probably the low, obviously the drought had a big effect across most of the Midlands and Northeast, but probably the biggest problem or biggest issue that guys faced was the amount of secondary growth in crops, especially spring crops coming up to harvest, especially spring barley and spring oats. Created an awful lot of harvesting difficulties, deciding when the grain was ripe, how to handle that straw, and just created an awful lot of difficulties in what turned out to be a very broken harvest.
A few people, Shay, mentioned the secondary growth, and I suppose what they were mentioning to me, at least anyways, is that some were convinced it probably added a little bit to yield for all the difficulties that there was with the green grains and green straw thereafter.
No doubt it did, but when you had that difficult harvest, the harvest was broken up into 2 periods, and some guys got cutting in the first half of August, and then there was a break for maybe 10 days or a little bit more. And it was that second half of the harvest that really created problems, because some of the moistures that guys were harvesting at were well into the 20s, and no doubt those secondary growths, while they contributed to yield, they also contributed to that high moisture content in grain in the second part of the harvest.
Okay. And Shay, just to follow up, I suppose, obviously the drought was in part responsible for that. And were there any farmers, or there probably was reports of farmers who probably got on slightly better even in those drought restricted areas? And do we know why that was?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons, Michael. I mean, around the Midlands here, I was talking to quite a few guys around out harvest time, and there were a couple of issues that seem to affect the crops this year more so than other years. Obviously, the drought kicked in, and it was the land's resilience to deal with that drought. And in the Midlands, I suppose there were farms where you would have relatively good rotations, and you'd have maybe use of organic manures, and that seemed to buffer it a little bit. But it only delayed it in a lot of cases. I mean, a lot of the fields around the South Kildare, Carlow area, they have kind of really sandy soils, and they tended to burn up quite quickly. But where we use organic manures, it did seem to slow it down, and where there was good rotation, it seemed to slow it down a little bit, but they did eventually have suffered the same fate as those sandy areas. If you take the northeast end, where you have heavier soils, some of that land dried out very, very quickly coming to drilling. And what tends to happen in that scenario is those seed beds get very lumpy, and it's very difficult to consolidate those seed beds. So you have a very open, airy seed bed, and they dried out very, very quickly. And the problem they have up there is they don't have a whole lot of rotations in a lot of cases, and they don't have much access to organic manures. And certainly the guys that did have both good rotations up there and had access to organic manures tended to have better seed beds, and those soils tend to be more moisture retentive anyway, and they tended to get on better.
Okay. And Ciaran, kind of going back down to your part of the world, Shay has mentioned the organic manures and rotations, even though you had slightly higher yields. Was there any, was that kind of coming through, I suppose, in the south in terms of guys who maybe had more organic manures and soils, or maybe had a better rotation? Were they getting on better?
Not even exclusive to this year, Michael. I know that when we record yields after the harvest every year, it's a common feature at this stage. You can clearly see areas, or farmers that use organic manures, soils with good organic matters tend always to have the higher yields, and obviously, as Shay said, you kind of tend to recognize it a bit more when there's an adverse weather like a drought, So certainly, there's plenty of evidence of organic manures there. In terms of the drought, while crops did get a little pinch, but most of the growers down south wouldn't have felt the effects of the drought the same as maybe the Midlands and further up would really. But I suppose really it was and I spoke earlier on about the potential that was in crops, and some earlier harvested crops that did yield very, very well. But unfortunately, we had 2 storms in August, and that was a big downer for people, really. We had Storm Ellen, first of all. That was a red wind warning, and the amount of ear losses, particularly in winter wheat and shedding, was phenomenal. I did some counts on one particular field. There was ear losses of up to 200 ears per square meter on the ground when you'd measured them, and if you kind of work that out, that equated to 1.25 tons per hectare alone on ear loss. And then you obviously had the shedding aspect there as well, And then on the 25th of August, a few days later, we had Storm Francis. Now that was mainly rain. And I think really Storm Francis was the one actually that had the biggest impact on spring barley. Crops were broken down after that, and there was very little spring barley actually harvested before Storm Francis, like Shay was saying, with the poor broken weather, So I suppose those 2 storms really had a big impact on the overall yields, with substantial yield losses up to, and maybe more in cases of a half ton in a lot of crops of spring barley, like.
And Ciaran, just on that, was it a country, or was it county wide? Was it all of the south, or was it just more localized, do you think?
No, it probably was a bit localized. Certainly Cork would have been the worst affected. Less so than maybe as you got into Waterford and the surrounding counties, Tipperary, South Tipperary. But once you got up to kind of North Tipperary, out to South Wexford, certainly the effect was, or the impact was much reduced, really. So certainly, typically, I suppose Cork County would probably have borne the brunt of it, really.
So, Shay, just coming back to you there for a second, most other years we'd probably be talking about disease control quite a lot all the way through the season, and farmers spend a lot of money on disease control. What way did that shake out or work out this year across the Midlands and North?
Well, I suppose, Michael, the truth of it is that disease levels were actually quite low for most of the season. For that drought period, if you take April and May and into June, we had less than 20 millimeters of rain in lots of those areas that you're talking about, the Midlands and Northeast. So disease levels were particularly low in all cereal crops. So from that point of view, I mean, the pressure wasn't there, so there was opportunities for guys to make savings there in certain circumstances. Just because the pressure was low. So certainly there were guys who maybe reduced rates a little bit, or they might have even skipped an application in one or two cases. And again, it came down to, in some cases, especially with spring barley, whether you could actually justify putting a final fungicide, for example, on the crop because the crop was so stressed at the time. So really, I suppose disease control wasn't a big topic for guys this year.
Okay, and obviously it's slightly different, I suppose, the further south you go. Ciaran, there was more rainfall.
Yeah, definitely, Michael. I wouldn't call it a high disease pressure year, but there certainly was plenty of evidence of disease. I suppose if we take winter wheat, we certainly did see plenty of septoria, and again, timings were crucial. I suppose in wheat, we saw yellow rust this year, particularly quite early, obviously in the likes of Bennington. It's not something that's very common down south, so I suppose it gives you an idea of the extent of or how big a problem yellow rust is starting to become. The barley was interesting, as Shay said, in a similar story down south. Disease pressure overall was quite low. We were worried about Romalaria, obviously the fact that Bravo wouldn't be available for the final sprays. That didn't turn out to be a big issue this year, in fairness. And I suppose the only other one that we would have seen a shared disease in is beans. Certainly chocolate spots started to come into beans there in June and July. And again, I suppose, look, that was just a symptom of the kind of wetter weather that was happening around that time,
And Ciaran, down south, obviously there was more disease and disease is evolving. Did we learn anything, or can we bring anything from 2020 into 2021?
I suppose, most people from a barley side, I suppose, Romalaria, as I said earlier on, would have been the main threat there. It remains to be seen. We know from our research that the loss of chlorothalonil will be a big issue, and I suppose that is a worry going forward, even though we didn't see a lot of evidence of it in 2020. I suppose from the septoria perspective, we do have new chemistry. We have lost Bravo, but the multi-site Folpet will be available for next season. I suppose from looking at trials and looking at crops this year, my own opinion is that we're going to be spending more to stand still, and I think that is a big worry. And I suppose as we go forward, integrated pest management, particularly the variety disease scores, are just going to play a bigger part for all farmers.
Okay, sure. Maybe it's the thing to differentiate or to get more crops onto your farm. So maybe the likes of beans, and certainly I know we've been trying to encourage farmers, and as much as the industry, we've been trying to encourage farmers to grow more beans over the last 4 or 5 years. However, I suppose not all farmers are convinced of it. But how did it perform, Ciaran, maybe first from your point of view down south in 2020?
Beans, yeah, I suppose, look, to start off with a record area beans for a start, 12,600 hectares nationally, and nationally the overall average yield in our Teagasc harvest report was estimated to be 4.7 tonnes per hectare. So that's slightly below the 10-year average of 5.45, So beans were quite variable down south. Again, in common with other crops, maybe flattered to deceive, maybe in some ways they did look quite good in the early part of the growing season. They got in good time. A lot of them were sown in March, but I suppose disappointed a little bit, and that sort of less than 2 tonnes per acre seemed to be the average yield. Anecdotally, the earlier sown ones did do a little bit better. So whether they were sown in the autumn, through the winter, or the early part of the spring, certainly the better yields that we saw down south this year came from those earlier sown crops, So going forward, I think, a lot of farmers are looking at beans. They can see the rotational benefits, and I suppose a challenge that everybody has now is controlling grass weeds, and they are an ideal break crop there in terms of, you can use different chemistry, you have the whole IPM measures of spring sowing and that. So they are, I think there will be a lot of interest in them for 2021. If you look at the price of soy at the moment, the price of proteins in general, it's quite high. So you'd hope that the price prospects should be quite good. And I suppose finally the department have confirmed that the protein payment will be available for 2021 as well. So again, that's a useful benefit there,
Okay, and Shay, when you talk about grass weeds, or Ciaran was talking about grass weeds there, it certainly, we've seen more grass weed pressure in 2021, despite some very late sowing. There was still an awful lot more of the likes of blackgrass around. What was the situation you seen on the ground, or has it changed a lot maybe in the last 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, I suppose if you take blackgrass in particular, Michael, which is the one that's kind of worrying a lot of people at the moment. I know we've other problems with sterile brome and wild oats, but if we take blackgrass as the signature weed that we're all kind of afraid of, certainly there's been more reporting of it in the last 12 months. And I know Jimmy Staples on the ECT program certainly now has identified blackgrass in practically all the major tillage counties in the country, which is a worrying trend, really, when you think about it. Now, we don't know whether it was always there, and it's just only being highlighted now, or whether it's actually spreading into those counties. I suspect it probably was always there, and people are more aware of it now and are reporting it more. But I suppose what is worrying from the point of view of blackgrass is that it's a weed that if we let it in at all, it can create havoc in an area. And given the fact now that we have large tillage companies or tillage farms who are traveling vast areas across the country, not just from county to county, but in some cases from different province to province. And if you have blackgrass seeds traveling in balers or combines or whatever it is, the potential of spreading blackgrass across the country is very high and very scary, to be honest. And the impact on the tillage farms across the country could be very significant.
I suppose what you can see from Ireland to the UK, if we compared the herbicide control or weed control costs, or the herbicide spend, if you like, on farm, guys in the UK are probably spending 3 times what we're spending here in Ireland, and still getting relatively poor control, with blackgrass being the major weed to kind of get out. So it's a massive cost.
Absolutely, Michael. And I suppose the point that, or the key learning that we have from the UK, is that using herbicides alone is not going to solve the problem, that it has to take a full integrated pest management control approach, including all your cultural methods, including cleaning machinery, not letting seed return to the soil, etc., etc. And herbicides are only part of that solution, not the solution.
Just to focus on just for a second, Ciaran, you have a couple of farms down south who are particularly affected by blackgrass. What's the start off advice for those farms where blackgrass is a major problem on the farm?
To be honest with you, it has to be zero tolerance policy. I mean, as Shay said, it just says that weed has obviously the ability to reproduce very quickly, spread from farm to farm, field to field. So it really should be zero tolerance. I've been involved with a few growers at this stage that have had blackgrass, and certainly the farmers that have been very proactive in managing it have been successful. And that's the switch to spring cropping. If it's bad, you got to go to grass for 4 or 5 years, but at a minimum switch to spring cropping, crop rotation, stale seed beds. They have been the primary methods of controlling it. And again, that zero tolerance, it's having done all of that, and then it's walking the fields and roguing. And I have a couple of examples of farmers who have done that and have been quite successful in eliminating it from their farms. I suppose the difficulty is where people stay with autumn sown crops. That is where, and you just can't, it gets to a level that you can't rogue it. And as Shay said, we know that we have a high level of resistance, so the solution isn't inside in the spray store. So it's a very proactive approach, really, is the only way we're going to keep it at low levels. I don't think we're going to eliminate it, but the priority is just to keep it at low levels, really.
Certainly, from both of you, just listen to the two of you, very much the case that the solution isn't with herbicides. You are not going to control it with herbicides. You need all the other bits and pieces out there. I just want to move on just a little bit. Malt barley has been, and continues to be a very important crop in the country, and probably it has become more so, certainly with the, I suppose, the continuing rise of distilleries out there, and there's certainly an awful lot more demand for it. How did it perform this year, Shay, in your side of the world?
Yeah, so Michael, the malt and barley probably performed slightly better than I would have expected if you'd asked me in early July, and yields were a little bit higher than what I would have expected for the most part. Now that said, there were some disasters around the place, but for the most part, I think guys would have been happy how it yielded. That said, there would have been relatively high rejection rates based on protein levels in most crops. So few farmers would have filled their contracts from that point of view, that the protein levels were just too high. And that's probably down to a combination of facts. Basically, the yield not diluting the amount of nitrogen that was put out on crops earlier on in the season, and just being more concentrated and higher levels of protein in the grains consequently. The early part of the harvest, if you like, that first part of the harvest was probably slightly better. There was, by the sounds of it, there was probably more rejection rates in the later that the harvest went on, and germination started to become a problem then towards the end of the harvest as well. So while the early harvested stuff performed reasonably okay, the later harvested crop was probably more problematic.
Okay, and was it something similar, Ciaran, down south in terms of rejection rates and early versus late harvesting and that kind of thing?
Yeah, probably farmers got on slightly better. I don't think there were any great issues with protein, but I think the yields were probably slightly higher down south anyway. The green grains was definitely a factor in the early part of the harvest, but I suppose we learn lessons from every year, and certainly given time, a lot of those plants actually matured, and those green grains didn't cause a massive problem in the end. But I suppose what kind of finished the malt and barley towards the end of the harvest was the two storms, and KPH obviously took a hit. And most of the rejections towards the latter end of the harvest would have been as a result of low KPH. So I would say satisfactory overall. I think most growers got in a reasonably good proportion of their malting contract. Protein's okay. Some green grain issues at the start, but KPH low at the end.
Okay. And guys, maybe just a quick word around the straw. I mean, straw is obviously a very big proportion of the income on tillage farms. It seemed to get off to a slow start, but how did it kind of end up? Shay, maybe you might comment first.
Yeah, Michael, I suppose you're right. It was a very, very slow start, and despite the fact that yields were in some cases 50% lower than normal, there didn't seem to be a huge demand, and I think that continued all the way through the winter barley harvest, through winter oats, and into the spring barley and the early spring barley harvest. But I think that break in the harvest in mid-August kind of concentrated the mind a little bit, and a lot of buyers suddenly came into the market realizing that there may not be sufficient supplies if we don't get into the market. That said, I mean, it was very, very difficult to get quotes for straw, even at that stage, even towards the end of the harvest. And it's really only after the harvest that the prices started to settle, or lads started to confirm prices. So while it was a strange year from that point of view, while yields were low, demand seemed to be low as well, unlike 2 years ago where demand was really, really high and prices were really, really high. We didn't see that this year at all. It seemed to be a flat market up until very late into the harvest.
And Ciaran, is it all sold down your part of the world? It'd probably go quicker down with you. Is it sold and gone, or what way is?
A little bit like Shay's story, really. Sluggish is the word I would use. There was no mad demand for straw during the harvest. Share went into sheds as it quite often does. And it certainly did pick up a little bit after the harvest, but I wouldn't say there's any scarcity or that of straw at the moment anyway. I suppose a lot of that will depend on the spring, I suppose, and how early or late the spring will be, I suppose.
Okay. And kind of moving on then, I suppose maybe after the harvest, it was probably there was a decent chance to get the new crop in, if you like, or the autumn plantings done. Ciaran, where has the acreage settled out in the south? Is it something similar to a normal year, if you like?
I would call it a normal year, yeah, definitely more like a normal year. I suppose the end of September and the first half of October, there was good opportunities. I think if you didn't get it in before the middle of October, the opportunities after that were scarce, you know. But I suppose people were bitten last year, and people probably went fractionally earlier, so I think that helped. I know on a national basis, we're kind of back to a more normal level of 125 or 6,000 hectares compared to 95 last year. So I think the big change there has come in winter wheat, which is up 56% on last year, really. So I think we're kind of heading into a normal sort of a season in terms of the area winter cereals.
Okay, the big one, Shay, that seemed to be a bit of a surprise to me, I suppose, given the poorish back end and the pressure that was on the just at the end of harvest, is oilseed rape. Seems to be in around the same area as maybe a normal year.
Yeah, it seems to be that way, Michael. From talking to the seed companies, seed sales certainly haven't taken much of a rise, and that can be attributed, I would say, to the workload that guys had in that period towards the end of August into early September, whereby a lot of fields would normally have been cleared and would be ready for oilseed rape. Guys were concentrating on getting the harvesting done, straw baled, and jobs like that done. And you know, while the guys who have oilseed rape in rotation and are convinced of its value in the rotation, those guys probably got more or less anything that they want drilled done. But new guys who had maybe planned on getting oilseed rape into the rotation, in a lot of cases, those guys, if they're coming in at something like spring barley or winter wheat, didn't really get an opportunity until mid-September to get the crop in. So they probably, in a lot of cases, wisely, in my opinion, decided not to take the jump into oilseed rape this year and wait until you get a more suitable slot, possibly next year.
And from what I see around here, certainly, Ciaran, the fact that most crops that are planted are looking pretty good, and doesn't seem to be too many holes or spots. Is it something similar down south?
It is really, and again, the slightly earlier planting helped, and I think seedbed conditions in general were quite good. So, no, establishment has been, I would say, good overall. Some of the late ones obviously will be a little bit patchy, but the vast majority are in good shape. I suppose the only thing that maybe slightly concerning would be that because of the weather kind of broke there, as I said, from the second half of October on, there has been very few opportunities to get out and get weed control done, or even, you know, to get insecticide on where that was needed. So I don't know, in the area I'm in, I would say probably 50% of crops maybe didn't get the weed control done yet, but you know, I suppose guys are happy to have it in the ground all the same.
Yes, I know what you mean. Shay, just coming back maybe to potatoes, and you deal with potatoes on a weekly basis. Brexit is obviously in the news, and there was plenty of stories about Brexit and its effect on potatoes, both seed and imported for the chipping trade. Were farmers expecting that, or was that something out of the blue, and can they cope, I suppose, in 2021?
I would say most farmers, Michael, most Ludean farmers certainly were aware that there was potential issues there. A lot of the potato farms in the country do deal directly with seed companies who bring in seed from outside of Ireland. So they would have been keenly aware of that issue, and we would have, our advisors would have made them aware of it all during the year, that maybe seed could be a potential issue if there's a no-deal situation in Brexit. So they certainly would have been aware of it, and to the best of my knowledge at the moment, most of them have at this stage made some sort of arrangement to get seed in before the 31st of December this year, so that the 2021 crop is safe, if you know what I mean, that they'll have the seed secured for those crops. In terms of the imports then of where potatoes are processing crops, I mean, that's a little probably a bit more uncertain at this stage, because while we don't know what level of tariffs, if any, are going to be on that crop, I mean, the supply chains that the importers have made for those, or have developed for those potatoes over the last numbers of years or decades, they find it difficult to break into them in many circumstances. So they're a little bit reticent, should I say, to maybe make big changes to their planting plans and their variety choices into 2021 to try and maybe maybe take advantage of some of those opportunities. It's a little bit risky yet, I would say, for a lot of them to make that jump.
I suppose at least they're thinking hard about it and planning around it. And I suppose thinking about that from 2020, the other thing that struck me was the fact that the planning for the new cap, I suppose, and underpinning that is going to be the Green Deal and farm to fork. And it looks like there's a policy has continued to shift, I suppose, and evolve. We always knew that the EU wanted more fertilizers and plant protection products to be used, if you like, and we're certainly more aware of the organic movement, if you like. So all of that is happening out there, Ciaran. Where do you think the big challenge lies in 2021 for growers?
I suppose the big ones will be the reduction in fertilizers and the reduction on plant protection products. From a tillage perspective, we can grow the highest yields in the world, but the factors that allow us to do that also mean that we have a high input regime. We have a maritime climate, we get plenty moisture, drought. I know we had a bit of drought this year in 2018, but that's not normally the problem. And plant protection products are very important for us to realise those yields. So there's no doubt there's a challenge. I suppose we have been softened up in recent years in the sense that we have lost some of our common products, and I suppose we are adapting. But I think integrated pest management will have a huge role going forward. I mean, we certainly will have more emphasis on varietal disease characteristics, and certainly in terms of forecasting of pests and diseases. We have examples like the suction towers for monitoring aphid flight and that. So all of those things are going to be increasingly important if we're to hit those targets. On plant protection products, on fertilizer, a 20% reduction. I think there probably is some scope, but again, it will be challenging. I think the use of organic manures, and I suppose the other one is the focus that we're seeing in EU policy in terms of indigenous proteins, likes of peas and beans. I think that will certainly help on both ends of that, particularly in terms of fertilizer. If you've got beans in the rotation, you've got one season with no nitrogen, and then you have reduced fertilizer requirement for the succeeding crop. So I think that emphasis on proteins certainly will also help us meet some of those challenges. But overall, we certainly have a lot of work to do to get there.
Yeah, it's a big challenge coming down the road, and I think farmers are going to be very conscious about our messages, lads, in the next long number of years. I think that integrated pest management, whether it be in disease control, whether it be in grass weed control, as we mentioned earlier, or pest control, as you mentioned there as well, Ciaran, there's going to have to be, I suppose, a lot more of farmers thinking about what they're doing from both ends. Either they don't have the chemistry on one side of it, or there's a serious need to protect and hold on to the tools that we do have. So, that's certainly messages coming down along the line. Gentlemen, I just really want to thank you for your time. I think it's been a great whistle-stop tour, if you like, through 2020 and a bit of a glance into 2021. So we'll leave it there, and thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
That's it for the Tillage Edge for 2020, and we'll be back again in early 2021. I want to wish you and your family a very safe and happy Christmas and New Year from all here in Teagasc. I'm Michael Hennessy. Join me again in the new year for more tillage news and advice.